Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and Senior B English. We are now going to begin a series of comments on T.S. Eliot's 4 quartets. We're going to do 5 lectures. This will be an introductory lecture followed by 1 lecture for each of the 4 quartets, right? Lectures 2 through 5. Now, the importance of T.S. Eliot can't be overstated. I mean, his dates, 1888 to 1965. Our study of Senior B, we've already seen a number of texts of T.S. Eliot. Let's just review, and while we review and introduce the 4 quartets, these 4 poems, I hope that you are taking a few notes that will then help you as you get into this study with me here in a bit. In our junior year, we introduced you to the love song of Childproof Rock, his 1915 offering. T.S. Eliot will, in that text, basically send notice and begin in many ways the modernist movement of poetics. Ezra Pound, the American expatriate, will be the one that helps him. We've given lectures on these lines elsewhere on LearnStrong.net. You can find those in the junior folder. You'll maybe remember the question, do I dare disturb the universe? Or I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. We made the observation, anybody can say, I wish I'd been born a crab. It takes a real genius poet, right, to say it that way. The Wasteland we've already studied in Senior B. That's the 1922 offering. We recently gave the lecture on Wasteland in detail. And many have argued this is the greatest poem of the 20th century. There's always a debate about that, right? Okay, so for example, some scholars will say that as great as the 1922 Wasteland offering is, 4 quartets is even more remarkable as a collection of lines. We'll have that debate. Now, the Hollow Men of 1925, 3 years later, we've also studied in Senior B. You'll remember this one, this 5-part poem. This will be important, as is the Wasteland, a 5-part poem for our study of the poems of 4 quartets. You'll maybe remember, we are the hollow men, we are the stuffed men, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw. Alas, our dry voices when we whisper together are quiet and meaningless. He talks in that poem about the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper. Now, about both Wasteland and the Hollow Men, and Proof Rock, we would say, that remarkable soliloquy of a kind, dramatic monologue of a kind. About all 3 of those poems, the argument has often been made, some of you have made it, that those are pretty dark poems. I mean, that's pretty dark stuff, and all 3 of those poems in its own way. What's up with Eliot? Where is his hope? Where is his joy? Well, a lot of that is going to begin in 1927. This is a critical date for our study of T.S. Eliot now, so let's put it in our notes. 1927 is a huge year for T.S. Eliot for 2 reasons. Let's write it down. 1, he has decided by 1927 that he will convert to the Church of England, and he's baptized into the Church of England. He becomes officially Christian. Now, that is a pivotal decision. There are a lot of people, we'll say this later, who get pretty offended by that. In 1927, we're going to talk a little bit later, he also will adopt British citizenship, which is also huge. This is very controversial as well, renouncing his American citizenship. 1927, he publishes Journey of Magi, which is another poem that we've talked about, and that whole notion of how beginnings and endings are quite remarkably similar, right? This is a poem about spiritual journey written after his conversion experience. We'll think about St. Augustine when we talk about conversion experience and all of that. Then in 1935-36, we have Burnt Norton, the first poem of 4 quartets. 1940, we have East Coker, the second poem of 4 quartets. 1941, we have Dry Salvages, the third poem of 4 quartets. And then finally in 1942, we have Little Gidding, the 4th poem of 4 quartets. Now, these poems were not published as a collection in unison until 1943, 44, and they were called the 4 quartets. Well, how specifically do we go about kind of studying the 4 quartets? There are a whole lot of ways to do it. Let me make some suggestions. First, I recommend that you do watch on LearnStrong.net my lectures on Proof Rock, Hollow Men, Journey of Magi. For sure, the study of Wasteland. If you're really going to take seriously this study of four quartets with me, you need to study my comments on Wasteland for a number of reasons. For example, I go into a lot more detail on Biography of T.S. Eliot there than I will here. I do recommend that you pick up four quartets. You can find a copy of it online easily. That you pick up four quartets and you read each of the poems on your own, applying, again, our learning theory of connecting new to old. That's always important for us to ask, what can I learn in a study like this that actually helps me in my life as a student, as a person, right, as a citizen? And then let's remind ourselves of the three levels of reading that we're always working with. At level one, what does the text say? We're just simply summarizing each of the four poems, each of the sections, 5 sections or parts or stanzas of the 4 poems. Okay. At level 2, we're going to ask a different question. Now, what does it say, but what does it mean? Here at 2A, at 2A, we divide to themes, messages. At 2B, that's the rhetoric side, not what Eliot says, but how Eliot says it. And we'll be looking at several things there at 2B. At level 3, we'll be asking, how can I relate to a text like this? If learning is the connecting of new information to old information, we're always worrying about that. So at level 3A, we're connecting the information that we're getting from the text to other texts that we know, as well as to real-world circumstances. And finally, at 3B, we ask the question, how can I relate this information to myself personally? Like, what is it that I can learn that somehow relates to my own life? Now, we're going to begin with a brief bit of biography, but we're going to concentrate more on that 1927 year because it's such a pivotal year for why the four quartets reads and sounds so differently from Wasteland for many, many years in 303. I simply had students listen to 2 things. One, the reading of T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. Okay, he just read the poem. And then immediately afterwards, I would just have them listen to T.S. Eliot reading the four quartets. I didn't give any introductory materials. I just said, hey guys, listen to these poems. It was the end of the senior year. Listen to these poems and you tell me how they're different. It was quite remarkable how students would say, the four quartet poems are quite different from the Wasteland, and Hollow Man for that matter, because they're so much more hopeful. Why is that? 1927 is a crucial year, so as we do biography, we're going to concentrate there. Now, I'd like to say it this way as well. We have the ability to draw trajectory lines between some of the major thinkers that bring us to T.S. Eliot. He was not unfamiliar, by the way, with these influences, beginning with Plato. Now, I've given Harvard Classics lectures here on Plato, and so you can go to learnstrong.net, go down that left-hand side, find the Harvard Classics folder, and you can go and look at some of those lectures. I've also given lectures on all of Republic and Plato for the learnstrong.net, and you can find that in the folder that says Honors English or AP English, okay? Now, it's significant that I mentioned Harvard Classics because T.S. Eliot had a cousin named Charles Eliot who just happens to be the president of Harvard, and when he put together in 1909 the Harvard Classics, there was actually a family affair, if you will, because Eliot himself attended Harvard. We'll get into that in a bit. From Plato then, as we've said in other lectures, from Plato, it's an easy step to get to St. Augustine, the great church father. And we've given lectures on St. Augustine and on the Confessions in the Harvard Classics, lecture number 57. By the way, if you haven't seen or heard or followed these lectures, I definitely recommend that you do that in anticipation of our study of four quartets. From Plato to Augustine, the next easy step for us in our study, and certainly Eliot saw it this way, is Dante. Now, we've talked about Dante already in earlier lectures, the Divine Comedy, and more particularly, the first section of the Divine Comedy called Inferno. And you'll remember that we said when we studied Wasteland and we studied Hollow Man, you really have to know something about the way Dante saw, in his poem, the afterlife, especially of hell, to be able to appreciate what T.S. Eliot's working with. Let's go ahead and put it in our notes now, circle it and star it. For T.S. Eliot, the greatest poet is Dante. Okay? Because Dante in many ways subsumes everything that Homer and Virgil did. Remember, Virgil leads Dante the Pilgrim through Inferno. But as well, Dante, because he's a Christian poet, and for Eliot by 1927, this is huge, Dante then subsumes everything of St. Augustine, Plato, St. Augustine, taking us forward into the modern age. And for T.S. Eliot, no greater poet did that. In many ways, Dante stands there then as the great poet in the mind of T.S. Eliot that will never be rivaled, but at least aspire to somehow maybe equal, right? From Dante then, Plato, Augustine, Dante. We then moved to Milton, and I've given lectures on Milton in the Harvard Classics lectures 14 through 39, where we spent a lot of time talking about the influences of Milton on the thought that would come. Now, that's interesting because T.S. Eliot struggled with Milton, but I think for obvious reasons he did so. And so if you go Plato, Augustine, Dante, Milton, all of those thinkers, I believe, are really important, and a lot of scholars do, really important to appreciating what T.S. Eliot is trying to pull off, especially in four quartets, right? Now let's talk about the basic structure, because this is another way that we want to talk about four quartets. The basic structure, then we'll talk about some outlining ideas and some thematic approaches to the four quartets, right? These are individual lectures that we'll be giving then on each of the four quartets. So in other words, if I talk about the Drei Salvages in this lecture, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. If you want to find that information, go and find the lecture on learnstrong.net in the Senior B folder, and I'll go into more detail there. Right away, though, I have to say out loud, I've been working with these poems, as I said about the Wasteland, for 3 decades in 303. And I owe tremendous debts to a whole lot of people who have helped me in my thinking about these poems. I want to mention 2 for the four quartets lectures, simply because these 2 scholars have really challenged me to recognize the significance and importance of T.S. Eliot's conversion experience and baptism in 1927 as being critical to the reading of his poetry. First of all, Alenza Stone Dale, her T.S. Eliot is a remarkable text, and I think it's one that should be looked at closely, because she makes the argument that Christianity was the air that T.S. Eliot breathed from the very beginning of his days on earth, because of his mother especially, who was a devout Puritan Christian. And in that process then, writing devotional poetry herself, four quartets in some ways was probably already set up for T.S. Eliot in his very young years. The other text that I'm going to recommend that you take a look at is Kenneth Paul Kramer's Redeeming the Time. This is a detailed analysis of four quartets from specifically the religious and spiritual perspective, and I have been very much indebted to what both of these guys have had to say. I will say that although I've taught these poems for, as I say, 30 years or more, I still feel very inadequate, as I said about my comments about Wasteland, in approaching my comments here on four quartets, and yet I'm going to go ahead and do it, because I think it's a set of lines, four quartets, a set of lines that you as seniors really will resonate with. In my end is my beginning. For example, as we'll ask, graduation a beginning or an end? Well, you'll say, yeah, it's both of those, isn't it, right? All right, let's do some brief biography. Again, see the Wasteland lecture if you want more detail on T.S. Eliot. He's born in 1888 in St. Louis. Think about this. Walt Whitman will die in 1892. Think about that. So the close proximity, right, between T.S. Eliot and Walt Whitman. There was a very interesting relationship between Eliot and Whitman. And Eliot often would argue that he never really read Whitman. I'm going to argue quite the opposite. I think that right away, the early influences of Eliot's Puritan background helps us. His Unitarian background as well. Go back to our comments on Ralph Waldo Emerson in the Harvard Classics lectures to hear more about what we said about Emerson. He studies philosophy at Harvard in 1909. There he is with his cousin Charles, the president of the school, running and publishing for the first time the Harvard Classics. In his time at Harvard, he studies, along with philosophy, he picks up his Dante. He learns Italian. He picks up comparative literary and religious studies, and not only now as an undergraduate, but later as a PhD candidate at Harvard. He studied as well the Hindu texts, especially the Upanishadic texts, especially the Bhagavad Gita, and as well the Christian mystics. That's a big one. We want to underscore that one. It's going to play heavily in our study of four quartets. By 1910 to 1911, he's in Paris, traveling, falls in love with Europe. Many have argued that this first trip to Paris was the kind of the gateway drug that led him back, and ultimately he found himself far more European, he felt, than he did American. Although, at the end of his life, he commented that his American upbringing is what informed his important writings, in especially four quartets. 1911 to 1914, he's back at Harvard studying Sanskrit, the Indian philosophies, the Bhagavad Gita. We'll have much more to say about that as we get into this conversation. 1914. He's back in London with Ezra Pound, an American expatriate poet. We talked about him in our junior lectures. And think about that. 1914, of course, is the year World War I begins. And it goes until 1918, right? 1915, he marries Vivian Higg Ward, and this is a tragic relationship, unfortunately. 1915 is also the year, of course, that he publishes Love Song of Childproof Rock. And there's kind of an interesting read of that poem specific to Eliot's troubled marriage, right? 1919, his father dies. 1921, he suffers a bit of a nervous breakdown, and by 1922, as we talked about in the Wasteland lecture, The Wasteland is published, right? By 1927, 5 years after he publishes The Wasteland, that's the pivotal year. Again, we said two important things happen. This is both of these very unpopular decisions by a lot of people, especially in America. One, he's baptized into Church of England, June the 29th, and this is really the pivotal moment for our study of four quartets. We go back, for example, to St. Augustine's conversion experience in the Confessions, you'll remember in Book 8. Go back to my Harvard Classics lectures on that one. That's such a pivotal moment in the life of Augustine. I think it's also a pivotal moment in the life of T.S. Eliot. The other, of course, is that he renounces his American citizenship and becomes British. And that's why, for example, in our study at Warren High School, that T.S. Eliot will be an American poet in the junior year's anthology and a senior British poet in the senior year's anthology. 1929, his mother dies. Again, she was an important Puritan force in his life. She even published some poetry through her son's help before she died. 1930, Ash Wednesday. I apologize that I don't have a full lecture on this one. It is an important first Christian poem along with Journey of Magi. And then in 1933, he separates from his wife. And in 1934, he visits Burnt Norton, which is this area that's going to be an important first step towards the first poem of four quartets. We'll have more to say about that when we hit that lecture on Burnt Norton. 1935, his important play, Murder in the Cathedral, which is going to celebrate Thomas Becket. And this is an important Christian text. And again, I apologize, I don't have a lecture on this one. It's possible that at some point I will do lectures on Ash Wednesday as well as Murder Cathedral for you guys so that we can study that in more detail. 1936, as we've already said, Burnt Norton is published. He also visits in 1936 the old church at Little Gidding, which will become important for the last of the four poems of four quartets. 1937, he visits East Coker, and this is the second poem of the four quartets. 1939, World War II begins. Now, as we've said in other lectures, think about that. World War I was not called World War I. You don't call it World War I until you have, tragically, World War II. World War I was actually called the Great War. And the assumption was that after that war, we will never, ever, surely, we're not insane enough to do this all over again. And in 1939, of course, it all starts over and finishes in 1945. Those are, of course, tragic years for all kinds of reasons. And they have a profound influence on the life of T.S. Eliot. In 1940, he will write East Coker, which is the second poem. 1941, Dry Salvages, the third poem of four quartets. 1942, Little Gidding, the fourth poem of four quartets. And by 1943, Four Quartets is published in New York. And 1944, Four Quartets is published as a collection, as a unit in London. So let's go ahead and say this. 3 of the 4 poems of four quartets are written and published during the Second World War, where Eliot played a role as kind of a guard or warden, and it influenced tremendously his thinking. All of England really was afraid that at certain moments that maybe the Nazi invasion was imminent. And of course, the bombing of London was horrific, and we'll see all of this referenced in parts of the poems of the four quartets. 1965, just finished the biography part of it. January the 4th, he dies. T.S. Eliot dies, and his ashes are buried, are placed in St. Michael's Church at East Coker, which of course is the second poem of the four quartets. East Coker, by the way, is where Eliot's own family and ancestors came from as well. Well, let's do now really quickly a brief overview of the four quartets. I'm going to give you several different ways to think about these 4 poems before we actually get into detailed studies of them. We'll begin, though, with this question, as we often like to do. So, why should I care? Don't just take my word or a lot of scholars' words for it. This is really important poetry. I challenge you, as I challenge you with any text we study, pick up the text on your own and study it, read it. And after study and reading, and the learning, connecting new to old, that we hope happens, I hope that you will find yourself saying, this is some of the most profound stuff I've ever looked at. I hope that's the case. I hope my comments help that to be the case, right? In many ways, let's say it this way, first of all. Four Quartets is a response to the dark vision of wasteland hollowmen. Proof rock, we might say, all right? You'll remember in Proof Rock he says it. It's impossible to say just what I mean, right? The great, in many ways, Four Quartets is the great accumulation of a great poetic life. Many of you will find this some of the most hopeful poetry that you've read since Whitman's Leaves of Grass. I think that's significant. Okay? Again, we've already said it. From Plato to Augustine, from Augustine to Dante, from Dante to Milton, and finally from Milton to T.S. Eliot. All of those great writers and poets ask questions about life, about time, about purpose, and we're going to see all of that in Four Quartets as well. Now, there are a lot of ways to read Four Quartets. One way is just to study the basic structure of the poems. Let's go ahead and play this game really quickly for your notes. We're talking about 4 poems, okay? Each divided into 5 parts, like Wasteland, like Hollowman, okay? And in many ways, this is kind of like the influence of Beethoven was prodigious for T.S. Eliot. He once said he wanted to do in poetry what Beethoven had done in music. And so it's very influential, and the idea of it being called the Four Quartets, originally the Kensington Quartets, but the Four Quartets, the use of the word quartet is a melodic, a musical term, and he wanted it as such, okay? Each section then does something kind of particular and special. C.K. Steed has pointed this one out, and we'll go ahead and put this in our notes. In the first movement, or the first part, of all 4 of these poems, you have some notion of time and eternity. In the second, you have some comments made about the dissatisfaction with worldly experience. In the third part of each poem, we have some notion of purgation and the search for love. You want to write that one down for each one of the 3 parts, and let's just pay attention to how Eliot plays that game. In the fourth, this is always the shortest. It's a little lyric poem, and we're going to see some kind of spiritual